Well, hello everyone, and thank you so much as we are dealing with some technical difficulties. Technology. Can't live with it, can't live without it, but you wouldn't be able to have two secretaries of state from Wisconsin and Michigan joining you if we didn't have this technology. So thanks for bearing with us all, and I am so excited that my friend and colleague and all around rock star from the state of Michigan, Secretary Jocelyn Benson, is joining us today. As you might have heard, she is an incredible champion and fighter in her own right with the work that she has done as Secretary of State. When you're looking at the 2020 elections and just most recently the 2022 elections. In fact, she received the JFK Profile and Courage Award and the Presidential Citizens Medal for her work. And as a result of these elections, not only did they have a record-breaking turnout, but they affirmed this importance with security and integrity around our election system. So we are so glad to have Jocelyn join us today. Thank you for being here on the summit, Jocelyn.
Thanks for having me.
And so we're going to just jump on in because I know we're kind of short on time. You, in addition to doing all this other stuff, had time to write a book about being like this guardian for democracy. And so can you maybe share with us about what inspired you to write the book and kind of what you have been seeing firsthand when we think about this?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It's really great to connect with all of you. I think there's really nothing more important than protecting our access to the democratic process. No matter what issues we are fighting for, prioritize, we need to make sure we all have access to the ability to choose our leaders and hold them accountable. And when we especially consider the challenges facing voters in rural communities all across our country, election administrators like us have to be even more focused and thoughtful on how we can make sure we're meeting everyone where they are and connecting and guarding their voice and their power to our government. So secretaries of state serve typically as chief election administrators and in most states. And after the 2000 election, actually, about 22 years ago, we saw how, for the first time as a country, how a secretary of state can truly impact, in that case, the outcome of a presidential election. There was a secretary of state in Florida, Katherine Harris, who didn't allow a full recount to proceed in a presidential contest, turning over the decision of who won the election to the United States Supreme Court and changing the course of American history as a result. And so in reflection of that, we have, I think, to recognize our power as voters and as citizens to ultimately choose who oversees our elections, who serves what's supposed to be as referees in this process. So I wrote a book back in 2008 after deciding to become a lawyer so that I could enforce the Voting Rights Act. I started noticing that these state election administrators or local election administrators were making decisions every day that could impact the outcome of your voice or your vote or your impact on the political process long before the courts even were able to step in. And I wanted to communicate to voters all around the country how important it is to pay attention to the referees of our elections, and that in a best case scenario, Democrats or Republican secretaries of state who have the chief election administration role in their portfolio can do great things to make democracy work for everyone. And as we've seen over the last few years, even defend the will of the voters if, lo and behold, there's a president or former presidential candidate who tries to interfere with that process. So the book is designed to tell best practices, almost like a Profiles in Courage for secretaries of state, documenting the ways back in 2008, Democrat and Republican secretaries of state were across the board doing a lot of innovative, nonpartisan, professional things to simply make sure the process worked. And the goal, again, was to communicate to voters that you have the power to choose your secretaries of state in most states. And I was so inspired by going around the country, spending time with every single secretary of state, telling their story through this book, that I decided to run myself in the state of Michigan and was fortunate enough to be elected in 2018. And of course, on the heels of a really great wave supporting female candidates, but in the just preceding what ended up being the most contentious presidential election cycle in our lifetime.
Well, and I think, Jocelyn, there is so much there. And one thing that I think really resonates with people are two things that you said. One is we know that all elections are local, and our local clerks and poll workers are doing such important work, and how important it is to really meet people where they are. And so maybe you can share too with viewers that are viewing from across the country, particularly in rural Michigan. Are you seeing these attacks on poll workers, on clerks? Like, what does that look like? And kind of what are you doing in your role to protect and, quite frankly, encourage people to go into these career fields, because we need these types of public servants?
Yeah, I think it's important to note the result of a years long effort to undo democracy, this multifaceted, multi state effort rooted in misinformation to try to diminish our faith in the democratic process, has really led to a lot of focus on the referees of the process, the state and local election administrators, whose job it is often to work behind the scenes to protect every voice and every vote. And so what we've seen is these individuals who are very much mission driven, these local election officials and state election officials who really, up until probably last cycle, have been outside of the spotlight, nonpartisan professional election administrators, were then jettisoned into this spotlight really in 2020 as a result of these lies and misinformation, and their work placed under great scrutiny. Now, the good news is transparency and scrutiny is our friend when truth is on your side. And so we welcome that transparency. We welcome those questions. But when they change from questions into threats, demands, harassment, multiple information requests that make it difficult for us to do our jobs, then it becomes a very challenging work environment, to say the least. And so you now have nearly a third of election officials who were present in 2020 leaving their professions across the country because it's become not necessarily what they signed up for. Now, I started my career investigating hate groups and hate crimes throughout the country for the Southern Poverty Law Center. So we very much am aware of the evils that exist and the need for us all to stand up to bullies at every step of the process if we're going to protect who we are as Americans in a democracy. But that burden should not be borne, that burden to stand in defense of a system that makes us who we are as Americans should not be necessarily borne by these local election administrators who simply just want to be able to do their jobs and deliver a good, fair, transparent, and secure election process for every voter. So it's become very challenging, but I'll just end by emphasizing we have to remember these threats and harassment that in many cases mark, unfortunately, our political environment right now, take on an extra perniciousness when they're because of lies that candidates themselves choose to amplify or spread or initiate. And so we, as people in the political arena, have a responsibility call out those who are lying about our elections, because the lies don't just end when the lie is said. The lie then permeates and leads to harm for many of the officials, the professionals who are charged with protecting the democratic process for everyone.
And I think, Jocelyn, something that I know I'm hearing it about, and you have direct experience working as starting your career with the Southern Poverty Law Center, as you highlighted, is is there a concern about these hate groups threatening or targeting, for example, polling places? And could that impact in-person voting, and kind of looking at this domestic terrorist lens, and how can that be addressed? And, what are you all looking at in Michigan on this?
Well, I think we have to be prepared for the potential for violence on Election Day. Unfortunately, we've been aware of that for a number of years, but we have to also recognize that just the threat or the rumor of violence could be voter suppression or voter suppression tactic itself. So we have a number of mantras in Michigan. First, prepare for the worst, but expect and hope for the best. So we're prepared for every contingency. Running the state's highest turnout election in the midst of a pandemic in 2020 certainly prepared us to be able to do that. But we're also trying to take this sort of two-tiered approach to ensuring that our elections are safe and secure, literally, physically, for every person and every poll worker. First is preemptive. We work, and we're already working now to prepare for 2024 to build partnerships all across the state with local law enforcement, with other poll workers, and increase the connectivity with people in communities to ensure that we're prepared to rapidly respond and address any particular issue that could occur. We're also working with the legislature to enact stricter penalties for those who threaten or intimidate voters or poll workers or harass them. And then on the other side of an election, we're ready to seek accountability for those who would try to interfere or upend the process. We're very clear. We want people to feel welcome coming to vote or observing the process or serving as a poll worker, no matter how someone votes or what their political perspective is. But the minute anyone crosses a line and does invoke any type of negative harassment or other types of challenges, or the potential for violence, then we will step in and have that individual removed, regardless of where they are in the ecosystem. And that has helped us really deter the potential for violence, at least in the last several elections, but also be ready to respond quickly if there is, to mitigate any harm that happens to anyone in the process. So I'm confident we'll continue to be prepared, and we're working with secretaries of state in other battleground states to ensure all of us are prepared for that challenge. It's something we can easily be prepared for, so that if anything is attempted, we're able to nip it in the bud before it becomes a greater catastrophe.
Well, and kind of another issue, let's pivot, Jocelyn, to something that I'm sure people on this forum have been hearing about, is the ERIC system, and how Republican secretaries of state who oversee elections have been pulling or threatening to pull out of the ERIC system because of these views of voter fraud. Can you maybe take a step back and share what the ERIC system is, and kind of how this has come to be, and what is at risk with this?
Sure. Well, ERIC is a national collaborative at its height, it had about 32 member states. It's short for the Electronic Registration Information Center. And it's simply a collaboration of information sharing among state election officials to ensure if someone from our state moves, say, to Wisconsin or to Ohio, and those states are member states, we hear about it and can update our rolls appropriately. The idea is to improve the accuracy of our voter rolls, especially at a time when people are moving from state to state, and also increase access to the registration process. Membership in ERIC requires us to reach out to every eligible but unregistered voter in every cycle and give them information on how to register to vote. And what has happened over the last year is that the former president and his most ardent supporters have really targeted ERIC with conspiracy theories, false, well disproven conspiracy theories about what happens to the data when states share it. The truth is, nothing happens to it other than states share it and use it solely to increase the accuracy of our voter rolls. But of course, the truth has never stood in the way of these conspiracy theorists. What's particularly disappointing is how many Republican secretaries of state, as NPR recently detailed, have decided to choose to side with the conspiracy theories, knowing that they're false, and withdraw from ERIC, thereby making their state's election system less able to remain secure and accurate, even though they know better. And ERIC's going to continue to exist. It's going to continue in some way to be that vehicle for us to collaborate amongst each other. But on a bigger picture, I think one of our strengths as election administrators is that ability to collaborate and work together. And what the states leaving ERIC have really emphasized or highlighted is the lack of willingness for that collaboration to continue into future elections because of the hyperpartisanship that has infected various aspects of our political environment, now infecting secretaries of state. And that's really the most harmful revelation from this whole issue around states leaving a collaborative to share information about voters moving from state to state. That decision to no longer collaborate with neighbor states is really a reflection of states overall digging in their heels into partisan sides, as opposed to being willing to work together despite partisan affiliation and do what's best for our voters.
Well, and just I think the final question, Jocelyn, knowing that we are running low on time, is all right, we now understand the ERIC system, what is kind of the conspiracies behind that. But the other piece we know is connected is how, Michigan, for example, keeps their voter rolls and what safety measures that you all take to make sure that voter fraud doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's a priority, and we all say it to make it easier to vote and harder to cheat. It's a priority for all of us to ensure every citizen has access to the political process and that we're doing all we can to protect the security of that access and of that process. So in Michigan, our voter registration lists are maintained in accordance with all state and federal requirements and include a number of checks and balances built into the system to bolster the process and protect against the potential for fraud. Specifically, our list is a statewide voter file, a database developed by the state of Michigan and maintained at the local level by municipal and county clerks. We have over 1,500 local clerks in the state of Michigan. They're the ones who input information, register voters, or remove a voter when they become ineligible to vote. And that voter file names all individuals who are registered to vote in Michigan and also contains the names of individuals who are no longer eligible to vote in Michigan and whose registrations are canceled. And that entire system is updated. And those, again, in that latter, just it's worth saying and emphasizing, individuals who are no longer eligible to vote in Michigan have their voter file canceled, so they're not eligible to get a ballot or participate in the process unless they re-register and show their qualifications. The qualified voter file is constantly updated whenever a new voter registers or a voter removes themselves from the roll, moving to another state, for example, or if the Postal Service alerts us that that voter is moved, or if that voter becomes deceased. And so our clerks are responsible for updating that information, and we at the state level help them and support them by contacting voters and also passing any information we have along regarding a voter's eligibility to those local jurisdictions. It's something I'm really proud of because we've focused a lot over the last 5 or 6 years on consistently cleaning and updating that voter file to ensure that every eligible citizen is registered to vote and only eligible citizens are on that file able to vote. But it's something we're going to continue to do, and certainly being a part of ERIC and working with other states and sharing best practices and details enables us to do that even more.
Well, and to just kind of maybe bring it all together, Jocelyn, because this has been incredibly informative. When you look at your work and kind of the future, what are you most hopeful about?
Oh, I'm hopeful that our democracy will be stronger as a result of the challenges it's faced over the last several years. And if you look at the story of our country and similarly the story of our democracy, it really is that withstanding the challenges that are thrown its way, whether it's wars or voter suppression laws or other types of tactics to impact the principles of democracy and the ideals of democracy. Every time that has happened, the people of the country, of our state and of the nation have stood up and pushed forward, and our democracy has become stronger as a result. And so despite all the misinformation, all the challenges, all of the speculation of violence and intimidation at the polls and all the chatter about fraud in the process and everything that's happening right now, we have to continue looking at the facts. And the facts are that more people are voting in Michigan and around the country than ever before. And so I'm very hopeful that we'll continue to see progress in more voter-centric policies, more voter-driven leaders, more voters taking responsibility, not just for their own engagement, but for the engagement of their entire community, more citizens thinking critically about how we choose and support our election administrators, more citizens serving as poll workers, which we're also seeing. So when you look at the basic metrics, democracy and the health of democracy is on the rise, but it is also facing some of the most serious threats it has ever faced. And that's why it's on all of us to keep moving forward with truth and the law and history on our side, to expand our democracy, to fight for laws and to protect those policies that enable access to the vote, and to ensure that we're doing everything we can together to protect and defend the voice and the vote of every American citizen.
Well, Jocelyn, I just want to say thank you so much for spending some of your time today sharing your experiences. I can say we are glad that you are at the when it comes to protecting and securing our democracy. And as a fellow Secretary of State, but who does not administer elections, I always love listening to you too, because I feel like I walk away learning so much and what's all at stake. So thank you for taking the time and sharing. And we are transitioning to our next session and speaker. So I'm going to take an opportunity to introduce JD Schulten, who's also a board member of One Country, who's going to introduce the featured speaker, which is David Pepper. And so Jocelyn, thanks for being here, and everyone, thanks for joining our session today.